What language progress can you expect if you're just reading and listening in the language? If you're a big fan of those comprehensible input methods, and maybe someone has told you that that is the fastest way to become fluent and that you should do it because eventually that's how you learn your mother tongue, I think you should watch this video because I'm going to tell you a bit more about the science of what you can realistically expect if you are following one of those methods, and then how you can actually compensate for what you are not getting through those methods and that you're probably going to need if you want to speak the language one day. And if you are wondering, like, who's this lady and why should I listen to her and how dare she say that comprehensible input methods are not the most effective methods on planet Earth? Now, my name is Esther. I am a doctor in language education. I have trained as a translator, as an interpreter. I studied 9 languages to different levels of proficiency. And my specialization is on the science of language learning, not just on what people say that it's the science, but really what research has shown that happens in your brain when you are learning a language. So this question came from Hillary, who is a member in my community. And she just posted the question, like, what kind of language development I can expect if I'm just reading or listening? And I thought, okay, let's see where this is coming from. So I asked a few follow-up questions, especially to understand what her goals are. Because if she tells me her goals are just to be able to understand Spanish, then I'd probably say, like, yep, well, you're doing the right thing. But she replied, no, like, I really want to be able to use Spanish one day. Then she explained to me that she has gone through a number of methods, very intensive methods, where they forced her to speak from day one. And she felt that even if she was putting much more time than most of the other people doing the course, she was still not getting results that were anywhere near what she expected. She was feeling very, very anxious. She was put on the spot when she had to speak in the language, and she felt like that was too fast for her and she just couldn't cope with it. So there was a lot of anxiety involved and a lot of feelings of not being good enough that made her feel very, very, very worried about the speaking in the language. So it kind of backfired because she felt that that method didn't work for her, and then she stopped it, and she found comfort in one of those comprehensible input methods that would tell her, like, you don't have to speak, you just have to listen, and eventually the language is going to come to you. And I'm sure you know the kind of methods I'm talking about because there are a lot out there. And on top of that, because of all the pressure she felt when she was doing the previous course, every time she tries to speak, she feels like it's too stressful for her and she cannot handle it, and all the words disappear and she just freezes and she cannot speak, which makes her really want to go back to her very comfortable reading and listening method. But of course, she's still wondering, like, will I ever become fluent just by doing this? And so she posted this question in my community to get my advice on it. Now, if you have questions as well and would like me to record videos answering them and get my personal advice on your specific problems, you may want to join my community. The link is in the description. Or you may want to join my WhatsApp channel where I usually publish updates and sometimes promotions that you don't get anywhere else, not even in my newsletter. So first of all, just to clarify that Hillary's case, it's not unique. These methods are actually very, very attractive and very compelling, especially if you have been burned by one of those speak first methods. Additionally, those methods are going to tell you that, hey, this is how you learned your mother tongue, right? Like, you didn't have to make any special effort. You were just like exposed to the language, and then magically your brain absorbed the language, and that's how you should be learning a foreign language as well, because why would it be different for a second language? Now, I'll record a different video on why adults learn languages in completely different ways from babies, and it has to do with our brains. We don't have baby brains anymore. Our brains are not able to absorb things that are happening around them anymore in the same way that babies do. So that's the number one reason why those methods fall apart at the seams, because it simply doesn't match with how our adult brains actually work. And we have a lot of research that shows that these type of methods and those kind of expectations are not realistic for the immense majority of the students. And they are causing as much damage as the other speak from day one methods, because they are making students believe that after some ridiculous number of hours listening and reading the language, they should be able to start producing language naturally. And when they see that's not the case, they believe that probably there is something wrong with their brains and they're not able to learn a language, and maybe they'll never be able to learn a language or to become fluent. And those beliefs can be so limiting that I've seen literally hundreds and hundreds of students who are stuck in language learning, and it's just because of those beliefs that these methods have ingrained in their brains. So in this video, I'm going to give you a few proper scientific reasons why these methods actually are not as effective as you've been told. But before that, I want to give you a bit of background on why so many people are misusing this term. So, comprehensible input is not really a method. Comprehensible input is one of the 5 theses that Stephen Krashen put forward in the late 70s, early 80s, when he tried to explain how a person learns a second language. And what this comprehensible input thesis try to explain is that when you are learning a language, if you are exposed to materials that are slightly above your level, just as slightly above, so challenging enough to motivate you to learn, but not too challenging that are going to overwhelm you, then that would be like the ideal level for the input you are getting, because you are still getting some learning out of it, but it's not so high that you're getting totally demotivated and you want to quit. Now, this idea is totally logical, and it applies not just to languages, but to anything that you are learning. Think about maths, think about any skill. If you are doing sports, you always want to be just slightly above your level, but not too far from your level to the point that you're just overwhelmed and want to stop. Now, the problem is that a lot of people and a lot of apps and courses have taken this out of context, and when they say this is a comprehensible input method, they imply that just by reading and listening, you will eventually absorb the language and become fluent. This is not what it was intended to mean, but it's true that this same author defends these ideas as well. So I think just by association, people think that when you say this is a comprehensible input method, it means that you're going to just become fluent from listening and reading. Now, eventually I'm a scientist. So when I heard about this the first time back at university, my question was like, okay, are there any empirical studies behind it that really prove that this is how we learn languages? And what we know now from research, and there are entire books that have been written trying to prove whether this hypothesis is correct or not. And we are very, very confident, and we have a lot of evidence, not just in second language acquisition research, but also in neuroscience research and the kind of research that speech pathologists do, to know that just reading and listening to the language, it's very, very unlikely going to make you fluent in a language. It's very unlikely to provide you the active skills that you need in order to speak the language. Now, there are exceptions, and I have to say this because I always get a student saying, yeah, but I know someone who just watched films in the language and suddenly started to speak in it, and it was amazing. Yes, there are exceptions. I've seen some cases like that, and there is a small percentage of the population that, for reasons completely unknown to me and to most researchers, still have a certain part of their brain that is awake and that will allow them to absorb the language and to absorb patterns and to imitate those patterns in a much more efficient way than the immense majority of the population. So if you know someone like that, yes, that happens. But if you've been doing these comprehensible input methods for a while and you are still struggling, it's probably because you're not in that very small percentage of the population, and you need a bit more targeted practice and structure in your learning in order to slowly start developing fluency in the language. Okay, so now let me share with you some of the most important research findings that over the past 20 years have completely changed our understanding of how the brain learns languages, and that prove that these comprehensible input methods only are not the best candidates to make most people fluent. Now, the first point, it's about noticing, and we have quite a lot of studies that prove that when students are exposed to the language without any direction, they're usually not really good at noticing things that are happening in the language. They're not noticing maybe like declinations, conjugations, plurals, things that are happening within the language and that are going to be key if they want to actually be able to express themselves accurately in the language. Now, we know that noticing is the first step for learning anything. If you don't notice that something is happening, it's impossible that you start imitating it or replicating it. So when students are just getting passive exposure to the language, they may think that they are understanding and that they are really somehow training their brain. And there are some positive things that are happening, especially in terms of intonation, melody, all of that. It's somehow getting ingrained in the brain and there is a benefit to it. But without a bit more of a targeted direction and like what they need to notice, it's very unlikely that you are going to simply start noticing all of those features of the language in a way that will allow you to start replicating them when you speak, when you produce language yourself. And what is very interesting is that we have some studies that were done about sound recognition, and they were comparing adults that were just exposed to the language, and then they were tested on whether they were able to differentiate certain phonetic features in the language, certain sounds. And despite many hours of exposure, those students who were just left to listen to the language, they were very minimally able to identify some of those patterns compared to other students that had been guided a bit more and that saw significant gains in their ability to recognize those phonetic features in the target language. And this again proves that we don't have a baby brain, while babies are still able to identify and to notice a lot of the phonetic things that are happening in a language, a lot of the sounds. That it's not the case for adults anymore. We don't have that ability, and that's why we need a bit more of help. We need to be a bit more strategic when we are trying to learn a language. Now, the second point, it's about the importance of feedback. And in order to get feedback, you need to produce language. So when students are producing language, they're much more able to start understanding the structure of the language and to realize what the gaps are in their language because they are trying to express themselves. So it's very easy to realize when you're missing words or when there are constructions that you thought you could understand, but suddenly you can't remember how to put them together or how to conjugate a verb or how to express exactly what you want to express. And that only comes through production. It's not something that you will necessarily notice before you try to produce something in the language to express yourself, be that in writing or in speaking. And most importantly, when you try to say it and you get feedback that tells you, no, that's not correct, or yes, that hypothesis you just made in there about how that expression works or how that structure works, it's correct. That's how the language works. And we all know in order to improve, you need feedback. And if you don't produce language, it's very difficult to give you feedback. We cannot give you feedback on what is going on your brain. Reading and listening are very difficult skills to measure because we don't have access to understand whether you are understanding every single sentence and noticing every single feature in the language. So the only way is to produce language and then get feedback on what you produce. The third reason is that when you're just listening to something, you're only engaging your auditory part of the brain. However, when you are also speaking, you are engaging both the auditory and the motor part. And we know from research that when you are engaging the motor part together with the auditory one, the more parts of the brain that you are engaging related to learning the exact same thing, the deeper those connections are going to be and the more likely you will be to remember them and to get them right in the future. So even if you are just listening to a video or an audio, the fact of trying to repeat after it, it's going to make your brain remember those words and those expressions much more than if you are just listening to it passively and not making any effort to try to engage with the material in a more active way. Now, and the last point, it's about using the language and what happens when you use the language beyond just putting a few words together in a certain order. When you are speaking, you are negotiating the meaning of what you want to say with the other person and of what the other person is saying to you. And you are applying a number of compensation strategies that are going to allow you to express yourself even if you don't have the right word or you don't have the right expression or you have to just use a more general verb or just an infinitive if you don't know how to conjugate the verb. All of those are strategies that are going to help you to become fluent. And we know that the most fluent speakers in a foreign language are usually very strategic speakers. They are speakers that have mastered really well all of these strategies and are able to express a lot and to communicate in a very accurate way with sometimes quite reduced resources. So not necessarily using more elaborate words or verbs or constructions, just simply by making a better use of those words. And the only way to get that is by using the language to communicate with other people. So if you are just getting passive exposure to the language, you are missing out on all of that communicative part of the language, which is eventually what you are learning the language for in many cases, not everyone. But if you are learning the language to speak to other people, then you need to try to start speaking to other people as soon as practically possible, but making sure that you are still within acceptable levels of anxiety. So that is when we know that we have to maybe step back and do some other exercises to prepare you for the moment when you will be able to use the language with other people and practice real life situations. So as a conclusion, for the probably 10th time in this video, just to say that if you want to start speaking the language, reading and listening are not going to help you with that as much as some of those people are promising you. And again, we have plenty of research and I could do an entire 2-3 hour video on it. There are entire books discussing this issue and proving that you're much better off doing some production in the language from quite early on in your learning journey. And I always say this is like running or like driving. Like, you're not going to become a great driver just by sitting next to a driver and observing for hours what this driver is doing. Yes, you may become familiar with what the driver is doing and the different maneuvers that they are performing with their hands and their feet. But eventually, what is going to make you a great driver is that you're going to sit down behind the wheel and you're going to start driving. And at the beginning, it's going to be terrible. And you may even have small accidents and you will make a lot of mistakes, but eventually it becomes easier and you become used to it. And believe me, speaking a language, especially a foreign language, is a much more complex skill than driving. So there's no reason why learning how to perform such an extremely complex skill as speaking is going to be something you can just absorb by looking at other people, when even simpler skills such as driving or riding a bike, you need to do them yourself in order to become used to how it feels and eventually make that skill become part of your own and not have to devote a lot of mental resources to making it work. So just to be clear, because sometimes I get this question, you're not going to stop reading and listening, but you're going to start adding some speaking and maybe some writing depending on the language you're learning and your goals. And you're going to start very slowly, especially if you feel anxious about it. You're going to start in very low anxiety context, maybe just speaking to yourself or speaking to a teacher that you really trust or to a relative that you feel particularly comfortable with, so that you can start using the language in a safe and judgment-free environment in which you are allowed to make mistakes. And you can learn from those mistakes and you can incorporate those corrections into your production in the future. And remember, we have adult brains. It would be the most amazing thing if we could just listen to a language and absorb it and magically be able to use it. But our brains, unfortunately, are not like that. But they're great at other things. And we need to leverage those things that our brains are great at and use them for learning the language in a more effective way. So as I always say, listening and reading are not harming you. Yes, you might eventually learn something and develop some level of fluency. My concern is that doing that exclusively is not the most efficient way to get to your results. And if you want to eventually become fluent in this life and not in another, it may be better to incorporate other strategies that are going to help you reach your goals faster than just that passive exposure that you're getting right now. And if you have been trying to learn a language and is struggling and you don't know why, you may want to check my latest workshop, which has helped already hundreds of students identify why they are struggling in the language and the specific actions they need to take in order to overcome those blocks. Or alternatively, if you found this content interesting, you may just want to subscribe to the channel. I've got lots of very interesting content coming up, including the next video where I'm going to be discussing specific strategies that I recommended Hillary so that she could go from just listening and reading to start speaking the language in just a few weeks.